Okay, let's unpack this.
Please do, because today we are charting a landscape that is, well, maybe the most familiar thing to every single person listening, and yet it's also the most profoundly
The
mysterious.
mind.
The mind.
Absolutely. Our mission for this deep dive is to tackle the greatest hits, the most enduring arguments within the philosophy of mind. We're going to be tracking this centuries-long, often really intense debate about what the mind even
If
is.
it's a thing at all.
Right, if it's a thing at all.
Yeah.
And, most crucially, how in the world it connects to the physical body.
And we're not just following one story here. Our source material is more like a map, a really comprehensive index and bibliography of all the key philosophical texts. It guides us across the main battlegrounds, the key concepts, and, the central figures in this whole debate.
And it really stretches back. I mean, we're talking about the ancient Greeks, Democritus and Plato, all the way up to the really sharp modern thinkers like David Chalmers and Daniel Dennett.
It's a roadmap of conceptual conflict, really. It shows you exactly where objective science just slams right up against subjective experience.
And that's the core challenge we're going to follow, isn't it? The mind-body problem. How do we explain our rich inner subjective life, our feelings, our intentions, that qualitative experience, if all we have to work with are objective physical laws?
Yeah, that search has basically generated every major philosophical movement in the field. We're looking for that fundamental answer, but at the same time, we have to try and avoid just getting buried in information, which is, it's tough. The material is dense.
We have to appreciate the depth of it, even if it leads us down some pretty strange paths.
And it does.
Speaking of strange paths, the source material gives us some really provocative hooks right from the start. I have to admit, seeing the reference to philosophical zombies in the index made me, well, it made me do a double take.
I'm sure it did.
We absolutely need to figure out why on earth philosophers spend so much time talking about a creature that's physically identical to a human but has, no inner life.
That zombie challenge is absolutely central to the modern debates, and we also have to define what the explanatory gap is. It's a concept that sort of describes this frustrating chasm between what your neurons are doing and what you're actually feeling.
And then there's this one last thing, a surprising little tidbit in the bibliography about René Descartes. The ultimate mind-body splitter, and this unexpected connection to the brain and the gut.
That's a fascinating synthesis of old and new ideas.
It is. It's a great final destination, but let's jump straight to the source material starting point. The original radical separation of mind and matter.
If you want to understand why modern cognitive science works so hard to, reduce the mind to the physical, you have to appreciate just how powerful and simple the original idea was.
Which was?
That the mind is a distinct non-material substance.
And this foundation is, of course, Cartesian dualism from René Descartes in the 17th century. He's the ultimate heavy hitter in this debate. His view proposed that reality is made of two fundamentally distinct kinds of substance.
Exactly. First, you have what he called res extensa, or extended substance. That's the material world. It takes up space, it has shape, and it's governed by strict physical laws. That's the body.
And the second one?
The second is res cogitans, or thinking substance. This is the mind. And crucially, the mind is unextended. It doesn't take up any space, but its defining feature is its ability to think, to reason, to sense, and to feel.
The beauty of this system is that it neatly preserves things like free will and the idea of an eternal soul, but at the same time, it lets the physical world, the body, be studied by the new science of physics.
It was a perfect compromise for the time. It gave scientists the mechanical world, and it gave theologians the soul.
Win-win, right?
Structurally, yes. But philosophically,
Yeah.
well, it created the ultimate lasting problem. If these two substances are so fundamentally different, one is spatial and one is non-spatial, how do they possibly influence each other?
Right. This is the problem of mental causation.
The central problem.
How does a non-physical thought, like my decision to stand up, cause a physical outcome, like my muscles actually moving? And it goes the other way, too. How does a physical event, like a pinprick, cause the non-physical feeling of pain?
Descartes knew he needed a point of contact, a literal interface where the two substances could sort of trade signals. And famously, he proposed the pineal gland, right in the center of the brain.
Why the pineal gland?
He believed it was the only brain structure that was single, not paired on both sides, which made it a plausible candidate for the seat of the unified soul.
It's a pretty amazing piece of speculative neuroanatomy, but you can see the dilemma right away. Just saying where the interaction happens doesn't explain how it happens.
Exactly. It still requires a non-material thing to somehow inject energy or information into the closed physical system of the body. I mean, you can point to the door all you want, but you still haven't explained how the ghost opened it.
That's the critical insight. The dilemma of mental causation is the one thing that dualism has never really overcome. If your mental state causes a physical state, then the mental has to be able to affect the material. And that, well, that seems to violate the conservation of energy.
And this huge problem led his philosophical successors to try and keep the spirit of dualism, the separation, but without the massive headache of interaction.
And our source map shows a couple of fascinating, almost convoluted attempts to fix this. First up, there's parallelism, which is associated with Gottfried Leibniz.
Parallelism just avoids the interaction problem entirely. It says that the mental and physical realms run perfectly parallel to each other. Think of it like two perfectly synchronized clocks. They were set at the same time, they're running in perfect sync, but they were never actually connected to each other.
So they just appear to interact because they match up so perfectly.
Right.
So when I decide to move my hand, that's the mental event, my hand moves, the material event.
Yeah.
But the decision didn't cause the movement.
Nope. According to Leibniz, they were simply pre-established by a creator, by God, to match up perfectly from the beginning of time. It preserves the distinction between mind and body, but you have to give up the idea of genuine human causal agency.
That's a high price to pay.
Yeah.
And then you get the even more radical leap, which is occasionalism.
Yes, from Nicolas Malebranche. This view is even more metaphysically demanding. It says that neither the mind nor the body truly cause events in the other, ever.
Wait, so if I choose to move my hand, I didn't cause it, and my brain didn't cause it. Who did?
God. On every single occasion when a mental event seems to cause a physical one, or vice versa, God actually steps in and mediates that link. Your desire for coffee is just the occasion for the real cause, God to physically move your hand to the cup.
So God is the universal remote control for the entire universe, moment by moment.
In a sense, yes, it solves the causal closure problem by making God the sole, constant causal agent. It's, as you said, metaphysically inconvenient, but it is structurally sound if you want to maintain two separate substances.
It sounds like dualism just had to invent these ever more complex external interventions to survive. But the problems don't stop there. The sources also point to a really radical break from the idea of any material substance at all.
And that's where George Berkeley comes in. This is idealism. Idealism just flips the entire script. It proposes the radical notion that objects exist only as ideas or when they are perceived.
To be is to be perceived.
Esse est percipi, exactly.
So I walk out of the room, the chair I was just sitting on, it doesn't exist anymore.
Not unless it's being perceived by another mind,
Yeah.
or, more importantly for Berkeley, it exists as an idea in the mind of an ultimate constant perceiver, which is, again, God. Berkeley directly challenges the idea of mind independence. For the idealist, material objects, in the way we usually think of them, just don't exist outside of a mind to perceive them.
Well, that certainly solves the mind-body problem. You just eliminate the independent body.
It does. But this all brings us back to the ultimate constraint, the idea that really killed all of these early theories for modern philosophy, the causal closure of the material world.
This is the non-negotiable assumption of pretty much all of contemporary physics and cognitive science. The idea is simple. Every material event, the movement of a protein, the firing of a neuron, has a sufficient purely material cause. The physical world is a sealed, autonomous system.
And that's the key takeaway. Interaction dualism, parallelism, occasionalism, they all fail for the same fundamental reason. They all require some non-physical stuff to intervene in that sealed, causally closed physical system.
And if that principle of causal closure holds, there is just no physical room for a non-material mental event to inject itself without breaking the laws of physics.
Precisely. And that scientific constraint basically forces the entire debate into the physicalist camp. The only way forward from there is to try and define the mental purely in terms of the material.
So dualism was discarded not because of some neat logical trick, but because of a deep commitment to the foundational success of modern physics. It forces us to try and ground this mysterious mental world in the understandable material world.
Right. Given that constraint of causal closure, the physicalist project began by trying to define the mental using only physical, objective terms. And the first major attempt here, mostly in the early 20th century, is behaviorism.
Behaviorism was this powerful, and you could say necessary, reaction against the psychology of the time, which relied so heavily on unreliable introspection. I mean, thinkers like J.B. Watson and B.F. Skinner argued for maximum scientific rigor.
And their solution was to just eliminate all speculation about unobservable internal states. Get rid of it. They adopted what's called the black box approach. The mind, the internal processing is just irrelevant.
So psychology should only study what you can see. The observable inputs, the stimulus, and the resulting observable outputs, the response.
And how those are modified by reinforcement, that's it.
So if I say someone is angry, a behaviorist isn't looking for a feeling inside them. They're defining anger as a specific set of observable behaviors. A raised voice, rapid movements, maybe an elevated heart rate. It's all defined externally.
Exactly. And Gilbert Ryle formalized the philosophical critique of dualism from this perspective. He argued that Descartes committed this massive category mistake.
The famous analogy of the university.
That's the one. A visitor to a university sees all the classrooms, the dorms, the libraries, and then asks, but where is the university?
And the university isn't a separate thing in addition to the buildings. It's the organization and the function of the buildings.
Precisely. And Ryle argued that the mind is not some separate ghostly entity living in the machine. It's just a convenient label for a complex set of dispositions, behaviors, and abilities. We're just using a misleading language that suggests it's a separate substance when it's not.
It's an elegant philosophical cleanup, but behaviorism just. It ran into a brick wall when it came up against the sheer complexity of human cognition, especially language. The sources point to Noam Chomsky's critique of Skinner's verbal behavior.
Right. Chomsky showed that the rapid, creative, and systematic way that children acquire language just cannot be explained by stimulus-response conditioning alone. I mean, children produce sentences they have never, ever heard before.
There has to be something internal.
There has to be an internal structure, rules, a kind of grammar that's innate. And this failure to account for that internal complexity meant that the black box had to be opened.
And once that box was opened, the field moved pretty quickly to the most direct form of physicalism possible, the identity theory. This theory, championed by thinkers like U.T. Place and J.J.C. Smart, made a really sweeping reductive claim.
The claim is that mental states, what they call types, are literally identical to physical brain states types. The mind is the brain. It's not just that one causes the other or corresponds to the other. They are one and the same entity, just viewed under different descriptive labels.
This is the ultimate mind is just matter argument. The feeling of pain is not caused by C fiber firing. The pain is the C fiber firing. David Lewis reinforced this, arguing that identifying mental states with physical states is just the most scientifically simple explanation.
But the identity theory had to deal with this really difficult challenge it inherited from dualism, which is privileged access, or what some call incorrigibility.
This is the fact that we have a special, immediate, first-person way of knowing our own minds that other people don't have.
Exactly. If my pain is just a brain state, why do I have this privileged access to it? Why doesn't a neuroscientist looking at my brain scan have the same access?
So how did the identity theorists try to solve that? It sounds like they're trying to turn a subjective feeling into some kind of objective observation.
That's precisely the move they made. They proposed that privileged access is just a form of internal observation. Introspection, observing your own mental qualities, is actually just the brain observing its own internal processes.
So you aren't experiencing something mystical. Your brain is just registering its own neural activity.
That's the idea.
But doesn't that just kick the problem down the road? Even if my introspection is my brain observing its own neural states, that active observation itself, that experience of knowing my own state, still seems to have a subjective quality attached to it. It still feels like something unique to me.
That is the sticking point, and it's a great foreshadowing of the hard problem we'll get to later. But the deeper, more immediate problem for the identity theory wasn't privileged access. It was the idea of type identity. It claimed that every instance of pain, the mental type, must be identical to every instance of C fiber firing the physical type.
Wait, so the identity theory is kind of anthropocentric, isn't it? It assumes that the only way to feel pain is to have a specific type of human nervous system.
Exactly. This strict type identification became a major liability. What about creatures with fundamentally different biology? What if we find a Martian whose nervous system is based on silicon, not carbon? If that Martian is clearly showing all the behaviors of pain, but it has no C fibers, the identity theory just fails.
It limits the possibility of having a mental state to only creatures that share our exact biological hardware.
And that's a huge limitation. So the lesson of the identity theory is that we have to preserve the physical grounding, but we can't be tied to specific human-centric stuff. And this
Hmm.
forces the field to pivot away from what the mind is made of and towards what the mind does.
This failure of the identity theory to account for multiple realization, the Martian problem, as you put it, is the exact moment that functionalism was born.
It is. If identity theory asks, what is the mind made of? Functionalism asks, what is the mind for and how does it work?
And this is a monumental shift. If the identity theory says mental states are defined by what they are made of, brain matter, functionalism says mental states are defined by their functional role.
Absolutely. Functionalism, developed by thinkers like Ned Block and David Lewis, defines a mental state by its place in a web of causal relations. Pain, for instance, isn't C fiber firing. Pain is the state that's typically caused by tissue damage, which is the input,
Which then interacts with other mental states, like the belief that I need a doctor.
and causes behavioral outputs like wincing or avoidance behavior. The entire pattern of those causal relations is the mental state.
And that structural definition is what gives functionalism its primary advantage, multiple realization.
This is the genius move that rescues physicalism from the Martian problem. Since mental states are defined by their roles, not their material composition, the same mental state pain can be realized in all sorts of different physical systems.
Carbon, silicon, Martian plasma.
Right, as long as they fulfill the same functional role, it counts. The mind is defined abstractly, which allows us to generalize it across species and, importantly, potential AI.
This sounds strikingly like computer science. When did philosophers really start treating the mind as software running on hardware?
It began with the early days of computing, leveraging the work of Alan Turing. If the mind is just a collection of functional roles, a system of inputs, processing, and outputs, then the brain can be modeled as a kind of computing machine.
And the most famous early test of this idea is, of course, the Turing test.
Yes, the Turing test basically set up an operational definition of intelligence. If a machine's conversation is so convincing that a human can't tell it apart from another human, then we should consider that machine intelligent.
It's a purely functional test. If it acts intelligent, it is intelligent.
Exactly. And this computational approach directly leads to the representational theory of mind, or RTM, which is closely associated with Jerry Fodor. If the mind is a computer, what's the language of that computer?
Fodor's answer was mentalese.
Yes, the language of thought. He proposed that mental processes involve manipulating internal symbols, like sentences in this internal language. Thinking, therefore, is just computation. Processing these symbols according to strict syntactic rules, the mind becomes a kind of semantic engine.
Okay, let me be clear about this, because it's a very strong claim. It suggests that when I believe the sky is blue, that belief isn't just some vague feeling. It's an actual internal sentence, a symbolic structure that my mind manipulates, like a computer manipulates code.
That's the idea. The mind is organized as a computational system. This explains why thinking is so systematic and logical. If you have the internal symbol for cat and the internal symbol for is an animal, you can syntactically combine them to form the belief that cat is an animal.
That model explains logic and structure brilliantly. But, as you alluded to earlier, functionalism and RTM face a massive challenge when it comes to meaning. John Searle pointed out that if the mind is just a semantic engine manipulating symbols based on syntax, does that actually constitute genuine understanding?
Searle's central critique is that syntax is not semantics. The computer looks at the shape of the symbols, the grammar, and processes them according to rules. It doesn't actually know what the symbols refer to. It lacks intentionality, that aboutness, that characterizes real human thought.
This is the famous Chinese room argument.
Yes. The computer can successfully translate a string of Chinese characters into a meaningful response by following a rulebook. But the computer itself doesn't understand Chinese. It's just following a program. The meaning is held by the programmers and the users, not the machine itself.
So functionalism gives us this fantastic structure for how the mind works, the software, but it completely skirts the fundamental question. What is it like to be the thinker?
Yeah.
Where does the subjective feeling come from? It's all function, no feeling.
And this is the failure mode that launches us into the deepest, most persistent philosophical quandary of all.
Functionalism seemed to solve the problem of physical grounding while allowing for generalization, but it just couldn't account for subjective experience. And this failure leads us directly to the great challenge of the hard problem of consciousness. It all starts with the explanatory gap.
The explanatory gap, a term popularized by Joseph Levine, describes this persistent intellectual roadblock we face. We can map every neural firing, every chemical cascade, and every functional role in the brain perfectly, and yet we still cannot explain why this physical activity should give rise to subjective experience.
Okay, walk me through this gap concretely. If I am touching a hot stove, we can see the C fibers firing, we can map the pain pathway in the brain, we can predict the withdrawal reflex. We have all the physical facts.
We have all the physical facts, but the gap is that we still have absolutely no clue why that physiological state feels like a searing, singular burst of pain rather than, say, a cool, dull throb or the subjective experience of the color green. We know the structure, but we don't know the sensation.
And that raw sensation is what philosophers call qualia.
Yes. Qualia are the subjective, intrinsic, qualitative aspects of experience. The raw, analyzable, felt characteristics of a mental state. It's the unique bitterness of coffee, the specific blueness of the sky, or the irreducibly unique feeling of pain. These are held up as the properties of the mind that fundamentally resist being reduced to something physical.
Thomas Nagel famously pushed this to its limit by asking, what is it like to be a bat?
Right, and this highlights the deep asymmetry between objective knowledge and subjective experience. A bat uses echolocation. We can study the exact physics of its sonar, the neural processing in its auditory cortex, everything. We can know every objective physical fact about the bat,
Right.
but we cannot know the qualia of its experience. We can't know what it feels like from the inside to navigate the world using high-frequency sound waves. That subjective perspective remains completely inaccessible from our objective third-person point of view.
And Frank Jackson took this kind of thought experiment and really sharpened it into a philosophical weapon with the story of Mary, the color scientist. Let's walk the listener through this one carefully.
Okay, so Mary is a brilliant neuroscientist who has spent her entire life in a black and white room. She knows all the physical facts about color vision, every wavelength, every type of retinal cell, every neural firing pattern associated with the experience of seeing red. She knows it all, objectively.
But she has never actually experienced color herself.
Correct. So when she finally steps out of the black and white room and sees a red rose for the very first time, Jackson argues that she learned something new.
She learns what red looks like, the quail of redness.
Exactly. And if she learns a new fact, and she already knew all the physical facts, then that new fact, the conscious experience itself, must be non-physical.
But if consciousness is non-physical, we are right back at dualism, which violates the causal closure of the material world. Jackson offered a really radical solution for this: epiphenomenalism.
Epiphenomenalism is a metaphysical tightrope walk. It tries to have it both ways. It maintains the causal closure of the material world. Every physical event has a physical cause. But it also acknowledges that the mental, the qualia, exists. It's real. But it's merely an epiphenomenon. It's like a shadow or the steam coming off a train engine. It's a byproduct cast by the physical brain activity, but it has no causal power of its own.
So my pain is real, but it doesn't actually cause me to pull my hand back from the stove.
Yeah.
The neural signal causes my hand to pull back, and the pain is just this passenger experience happening in parallel.
Exactly. The brain activity causes both the physical reflex and the mental pain, but the pain itself is causally inert. It does nothing. This preserves physical closure, but at the cost of rendering consciousness a passive, ineffectual byproduct. It's a very counterintuitive answer to the question of why we even have consciousness at all.
And this desperation to account for qualia leads us to the most famous thought experiment in this whole area, the philosophical zombie.
Right, deployed by thinkers like Robert Kirk and David Chalmers. As you said before, a philosophical zombie is a hypothetical creature that is a perfect physical duplicate of a human. Every atom, every neuron, every firing pattern is identical. If you jab it with a pin, it will shout, ouch, and pull its hand away.
But the key difference is that internally, it has no qualia. It is dark inside. It performs the function of pain, but it experiences nothing.
And the argument is, if such a creature is even conceptually possible, if the idea is coherent and doesn't contradict itself, then consciousness cannot be just a physical fact. Because if consciousness were nothing more than the physical structure, then two physically identical beings must share every property, including experience.
The possibility of the zombie suggests that consciousness is an additional, non-reductive property of reality.
And this is the move to what's called property dualism. We don't have two separate substances like Descartes claimed, but we have one substance matter with two distinct kinds of properties. Physical properties like mass and charge, and non-reductive mental properties like qualia.
Faced with these apparently intractable problems, the zombie, the explanatory gap, a few radical physicalists adopted a position that just bypasses the problem entirely.
Eliminativism.
This feels like throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
It is absolutely radical. Paul and Patricia Churchland argue that the concepts we use every day to describe the mind, belief, desire, fear, sensation, what they call folk psychology, are not references to real things at all. They are just theoretical posits from a failed theory.
So when I say I believe it will rain, I'm not actually describing a real mental state.
Correct. They argue that folk psychology is an outdated theory and it's destined for the garbage bin, just like scientists once talked about caloric as the substance of heat before thermodynamics proved it was just kinetic energy.
So the idea is that once neuroscience matures, we'll stop talking about beliefs and start talking about, I don't know, neural networks and specific configurations of synaptic weights.
We'll just eliminate the old concepts.
But wait, how do they even state their claim? As our sources note, the most common counter-argument is the self-refuting character of eliminativism. If you claim that belief does not exist, you must necessarily believe that claim is true.
And that's the classic philosophical paradox. Eliminativism struggles to articulate its own position without using the very intentional propositional concepts it wants to eliminate. It's really hard to make a statement of fact without implying that you have a belief in that fact. It just reveals how deeply embedded folk psychology is in our ability to reason and communicate.
Okay, so having seen these internal reductive projects, identity theory, functionalism struggle with qualia, we now shift to external approaches. These theories focus less on what the mind is internally and more on how we, as observers, know or interpret what someone else is thinking. This brings us to Donald Davidson and his interpretationism.
Davidson's central challenge was the problem of radical interpretation. Imagine you encounter an alien species or an entirely foreign culture. You're starting from absolute zero, no shared language, no shared cultural beliefs. How do you simultaneously figure out what their sentences mean and what they believe about the world?
That seems like an impossible circular task. To understand what someone means by Gavagai, I need to know they believe it refers to a purple cow. But to know they believe that, I have to already know what Gavagai means.
You've hit the paradox exactly. And Davidson's answer is that you break the circle out of necessity by assuming rationality. You apply the principle of charity.
The principle of charity.
Yes. To successfully interpret another person, you have to assume that their beliefs are mostly true, rational, and coherent, especially when those beliefs relate to shared, observable things in the environment.
So if the alien points at a tree and utters a sound, and I see they do this consistently when trees are around, I charitably assume their utterance means tree because it's rational to believe a tree is there when you're looking at one. I have to anchor their beliefs to my own rational framework.
Exactly. And this implies that mental states, especially propositional attitudes like beliefs and desires, are defined by their role within this theoretical framework of interpretation that an observer uses, not just by some internal neurological state.
But doesn't this run into the problem of indeterminacy? If interpretation is just a framework we impose, how can we be sure we got the right one? Quine argued that multiple, equally valid interpretations might be possible.
That's the enduring consequence of interpretationism. Meaning might not be a hard fact locked inside the speaker's head. It might be relative to the framework used by the interpreter. And to manage this ambiguity, Davidson uses tools from things like decision theory and the idea of coordinate systems. You have to assign the speaker preferences and beliefs by establishing a stable frame of reference.
A shared, objective external world that links their utterances to facts.
You have to. And this external observer-centric view really sets the stage for Daniel Dennett, who formalized this idea into his concept of predictive stances. He argues that whether something has a mind is less about its internal stuff and more about the best strategy we have for predicting its behavior.
And Dennett offers 3 ascending levels of predictive strategy. The first and simplest is the physical stance.
Right. That's where you predict behavior based purely on physical laws. If I drop a rock, I predict where it will land using gravity and aerodynamics. It requires knowing the physics of the system. Pretty straightforward.
The next level up is the design stance.
Yes. Here, you predict behavior based on what the object is designed to do, regardless of the underlying physics. If I see a complex machine, I predict its behavior based on its blueprint or its purpose. I predict my chess computer will make a good move based on its programming, not by calculating the physics of its silicon chips.
And finally, the highest and most important level for psychology is the intentional stance.
The intentional stance is what we use when a system is too complex for the physical or design stances to be practical. To use the intentional stance, we treat the system as a rational agent that has beliefs and desires. We then predict that the system will act in a way that satisfies its desires given its beliefs.
So if I predict that you will go get a coffee, I don't need to model your neurons, which is the physical stance, or your learned coffee ordering program, which is the design stance. I just assume you desire caffeine and you believe the shop down the street is open.
And that's the incredible power of the intentional stance. It's a stunningly efficient predictive tool. For Dennett, our minds are real, but they are real in the way that patterns are real. They're real patterns that we discern most effectively by using this stance.
And he applies this idea to classify the evolution of mental complexity.
He does. He describes a hierarchy starting with the simplest, the Skinnerian mind, which is just pure associative learning and reinforcement, simple conditioning.
And above that,
Above that is the Darwinian mind, where innate structures are refined by natural selection over generations. Then you have a crucial jump to the Popperian mind.
what's special about the Popperian mind?
The Popperian mind is one that can simulate possibilities internally before it acts. It can model its environment and predict the consequences of an action inside its head. Dennett describes this as the ability for an organism to let its hypotheses die in its stead.
It can reject a bad idea without being physically destroyed by the bad action.
Right. And the most complex level, where human consciousness really takes off, is what he calls the Gregorian mind.
The Gregorian mind.
This mind is defined by high-level representation and, crucially, the ability to use external tools, especially language, writing, and cultural knowledge, to organize and communicate thought. This external scaffolding vastly increases the complexity and reach of our internal representations. For Dennett, minds are these real patterns defined by the success of the intentional stance in predicting them.
Okay, before we dive even deeper into metaphysics, let's take a breath. We've established that the mind is not a separate ghost, so dualism is out. And defining it purely by its composition, like the identity theory, or its function, like functionalism, seems to fail the test of subjective experience, of qualia.
Exactly. And what this reveals is that the mind-body debate isn't just a psychological or a neurological problem. It forces us to confront the deep metaphysical structure of the world itself, what exists, its ontology, and how those existing things relate to each other. The ultimate solution, if there is one, has to solve the riddle of properties and causality.
So let's start with the structure of reality. The sources describe the layered view of the world. What does that mean, and why is it important for the mind?
It means reality can be described at different levels, or strata. And crucially, we have to distinguish between levels of description and ontological levels. Levels of description refer to the different sciences we use: physics, chemistry, biology, psychology.
Right, and the laws of physics are supposed to be absolute. But the laws of the special sciences, like psychology, are often phrased as ceteris paribus laws, all else being equal. Why that little caveat?
Because psychological laws like people desire food when hungry are not strict in the way physical laws are. They're generalizations that hold true mostly, but they can be broken by individual differences or abnormal physical conditions. They are useful descriptions, but they don't describe the most fundamental level of reality.
So the deeper question for ontology is whether that higher level, say a psychological law, is truly a distinct thing, or if it's just a complex, useful arrangement of the lower level, which is the physical arrangement of atoms and molecules. This brings us to the nature of properties.
Yes. A central question here is whether properties are universals abstract entities share across many different things, like how all red things share the universal redness, or whether they are particularized ways or tropes.
Which would be unique, individual instances of a property that can't be shared, only resembled.
Precisely. This seems very abstract, but the importance here is whether mental properties, like a belief, are genuine, irreducible features of reality, or just convenient ways of categorizing a complex arrangement of physical particles.
And this leads to the critical concept that tries to bridge the gap between function and matter, dispositionality.
Yes, championed by thinkers like C.B. Martin and John Heil. This is where we get really deep into the metaphysics.
Why are we going so deep into properties? Is this a way for physicalism to kind of smuggle qualia back in? Is it a type of active property?
That's the key insight. Traditional views often saw properties as static qualities. The dispositional view posits that genuine properties have a dual nature. They aren't just static qualities, they are active powers.
Give me an analogy here, because this is dense material.
Okay, think of a piece of glass. It has a qualitative or categorical aspect. That's what it is like. It's transparent, it's solid, it's smooth, but it also has a dispositional aspect, which is what it does. It has the power or disposition to break when struck.
And you can't separate the two.
You can't separate the glass's categorical properties from its dispositional causal powers. They are two sides of the same coin.
So if mental properties are dispositional, they aren't merely these inert epiphenomena, like Jackson suggested with his qualia.
Whoa.
They are active causal powers.
Absolutely. This gives the mental property, whether it's a pain or a belief, a causal bite. It solves the problem of mental causation while staying grounded in the physical world. Causation works through the reciprocity of dispositionality. Properties exist in a power net where my intention, which is a dispositional property, requires the reciprocal dispositional property of my muscle fibers to actually manifest the action.
This provides a deep metaphysical grounding relation that links these properties to reality. The physical stuff is the mental property, just viewed through the lens of its active powers.
And this ties directly back to functionalism through the crucial concept of supervenience. Functionalism defined mental states as second-order properties, the functional roles. These roles are then realized by first-order properties, which are the dispositional physical properties of the brain. The physical facts ground the functional facts. There can be no change in the mental without a corresponding change in the physical. This is how the functional mind is pinned to physical reality.
So finally, let's revisit intentionality, the mind's ability to be about something. We saw Davidson suggesting the mind might be externally defined by interpretation. This idea is formalized in externalism, associated with Hilary Putnam and Tyler Burge.
Externalism is the really radical claim that the content of the mind, what our thoughts actually mean, is not determined solely by what is physically inside our skulls. Meaning and intentionality are determined, at least in part, by the external environment and our history of interaction with that environment.
Okay, walk me through the thought experiment slowly, the famous twin Earth scenario, so the listener can really visualize the implication that meaning is external.
Okay, imagine Earth, where water is H0. Now imagine Twin Earth, an identical planet orbiting a distant star. Every person on Twin Earth and every physical object is a molecule-for-molecule duplicate of its Earth counterpart. But there's one exception. The clear, drinkable liquid in their lakes and rivers that they call water is actually a complex compound, XYZ.
Okay, so I am physically identical to my twin Earth duplicate. Our brain states are absolutely identical.
Right. Now, if you, on Earth, think the thought, water is delicious, your thought is about H0. But when your twin on Twin Earth thinks the exact same physically identical thought, the same neural configuration is firing, their thought is about XYZ.
Wait a second. If our brains are identical, but the content of our thoughts is different, then the content of the thought cannot be determined solely by what is physically in the head.
That is the profound conclusion of externalism.
The meaning must be determined by the external substance we grew up interacting with.
Exactly. The history of interaction with the environment grounds the intentionality of your mental states. The mind, even if it's physically grounded in the brain, is partially defined by its embedding in the world. It's a powerful final concept that shows the mind-body problem isn't just about finding the right internal theory, it forces us to find the right theory of the world itself. Our journey through this intellectual landscape of the mind has been a rapid tour of philosophical necessity. We began with the radical separation of mind and body in dualism, which ran immediately into the inescapable scientific hurdle of causal closure, and that necessity forced philosophers into the physicalist camp.
From there, we attempted simple, direct reduction with the identity theory, only to be blocked by the problem of multiple realization. So we generalized the idea of the mind as a machine through functionalism, defining it by its computational function.
But that success with function created this new crisis of feeling. Functionalism utterly failed to account for the inner life, the qualia, which generated the intractable explanatory gap and the challenge of the philosophical zombie. And these failures pushed the field to the extremes, either eliminating the mind entirely or revising the deep metaphysics of reality itself, defining properties not as static qualities, but as active dispositional powers.
The key takeaway seems to be that the question of the mind isn't just a scientific challenge for brain scanners.
Yeah.
It's a fundamental metaphysical riddle about how reality is structured and how we as observers interpret meaning and existence.
And if we look across all these competing theories, from Fodor's representational theory of mind to Davidson's interpretationism to Dennett's intentional stance, a common thread emerges. The mind is defined by its ability to represent the world.
We use representation for everything. The sources mention the use of internal mental imagery. the cognitive milestone where children develop an understanding of false belief, that someone else can hold a representation of the world that is wrong, and even how monkeys see the world, which relies on sophisticated social mapping.
Indeed, these are all examples of systems creating and manipulating internal models of their environment.
So here's the final provocative thought for you to explore, building on this idea of representation. We've seen the concept of a simple cognitive map, like the one used to explain navigation in rats. And we also see the complex, language-driven, propositional attitudes required for the Gregorian mind. If our ability to represent the world is the true hallmark of the mind, where does that ability truly begin? And where does it transition from a simple, unconscious spatial map to the complex, reflective, language-dependent, intentional thought required for philosophy?
And what does that distinction say about all the other minds, animal and artificial, that fall somewhere in between? Something to mull over until our next deep dive.
See you soon!